I am so happy to be here today with Matthew Allison, a friend that's been on the channel, the podcast. I don't know what we call ourselves. A friend that has been on the Meaning Code numerous times since the beginning, and I always value Matthew's outlook. He's an Orthodox Christian who lives in South Dakota and works there and loves to write. And I was remembering back to one episode we did where we sort of theorized about what it would be like to write a detective novel. And I really loved that. I don't think that episode got that many views, but I really loved that conversation. But we've had many other conversations about philosophy and science and history and theology. So I'm looking forward to today because we're going to explore the concepts of infinite and finite and what are the implications of both of them when we're thinking about issues, scientific issues, metaphysical issues, philosophical, theological. So Matthew, I gave you kind of what I was wondering about, and I'd just like you to share what you're thinking.
Thank you for having me on again, Karen. It's great to be here. I enjoyed recently listening to your conversation with two people, two scholars in their respective domains, talking about the overlaps and the gaps between literature and large language models. So there is a whirlwind of beautiful information coming through your channel, and I'm grateful to be one part of it. With respect to the infinite and the finite, it has a long tail, of which I know bits and pieces, but I know those bits and pieces are connected because, if I may say, tongue in cheek, obviously, we have not arrived at an answer as to how to tie up the infinite and the finite into a bow tie. If someone were to do that, he or she is on the other side of the heaven-earth divide. But there are mile markers, if one were to look into, say, secular history or an academic history, where people have put on the table these topics and have offered arguments as to which one has priority. That is to say, is one more real than the other? And so the other should be looked at as a sort of derivative or shadow cast from the bigger substance of the other, which might ironically be the finite. Because reality having proportions, dimensions, is an assumption that if someone is not critical of that difference, which we are investigating between the finite and the infinite, they might lackadaisically assume the finite has to have dimensions. But what if we begin with the beginner's mind and sort of interrogate the question? What makes the infinite infinite? What makes the finite finite? Can we, as what we are, know what makes something finite, given its interaction with us, whatever it is? Now, that rehearsed in that way is an epistemic or an epistemological BART train into the skyscrapers of the infinite finite difference. But there are other ways to enter that landscape. You could do it ontologically, which later philosophers have done. Martin Heidegger, for instance, he might not have said the infinite, but he was trying to approach the finite through his teacher, whose name escapes me at the moment. Maybe one of your listeners will remember. He was trying to approach the finite ontologically through his experience. And in order to share that experience, he had to develop a methodological path that he could share in language to another that was not him, but another that could receive the language and so could derive or see through the language the path that Heidegger had walked down to have his experience of some finite thing. The name of the finite thing Heidegger gave, which he thought was quite simple, was being there, as a hyphen, this being there, this being hyphen in hyphen the hyphen world. In other words, a
Is
name for
that
something.
word Dasein?
Yeah.
Okay.
This thing that is in situation, explicitly and implicitly. But we can go down these BART trains into the skyscrapers of the infinite and the finite and lose ourselves in all these conversations. But what I want to do with our conversation, and take it anywhere you want, is I want to step back from all that. People can go to the 18th century, 19th century, they can go further back to the Greeks, way before Socrates, to riddles and paradoxes of how motion is impossible if they want to look at examples of how you can't reduce the infinite to the finite and how you can't blow up the finite into the infinite. But if we step back, there's a guiding light for me recently. He's a contemporary philosopher. His name is Christos Yanaris. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing his last name incorrectly. He is a student of this phenomenological stream, which I've tried to give some taste of through talking about Heidegger and trying to come to experience, and then developing an analytic whereby I can describe that experience I had to someone else who is not having that experience, but through that tightly woven analytic, they can come to that experience with their own being there. Now, interestingly enough, that might remind someone of poetry, which is how Heidegger himself developed. He went from being a metaphysician of ontology, or the question of ontology, to a metaphysician of the poet, where he famously said, just listen to the poets. No, stop. Don't listen to the poets, just listen. Now, this might remind someone of Wittgenstein at the end of his Tractatus, where he said, if anyone's understood what I've said at all, they will have understood that I said nothing, and they can kick the ladder beneath them if they've made it all the way up and start doing what they're supposed to be doing. In other words, language as the analytic vehicle to take us to the experience isn't the same thing as a textbook taking us to the theorem of math, where, okay, because I've read the textbook and I've studied the problem set, I know the theorem, and I can reproduce the theorem on a chalkboard for another. What the phenomenologists tried to do with their invention, I would say, their rhetorical invention of the analytic, was they wanted to do something akin to storytelling. That is to say, in their meticulous development of an analytic that would serve the purpose of bringing someone who did not have their experience of being there into a mode whereby they could, as it were, spontaneously have the experience of being there. In order for the analytic to do its work of mediation, it had to not only lead, but it had to make you the sort of person who, at the end of the leading, could receive the gift of the being there. So it almost taught etiquette as well as where to go. It's not a self-driving car that takes you where you want to go, but you're not changed as a person when you get there. It's a sort of constant companion who teaches you who you ought to be, so that as it takes you where you're going, you can be received ideally. Not as someone who made it all that way, but I don't want to go in there. Not because it's so ugly, but because something inside is not prepared to take that open door as a welcoming signal. So they tried to do something, I would say, they tried to offer consolation and character building along with the navigational route in their analytics. So it was trying to serve two purposes, and that's why I call it akin to storytelling. A good story not only takes us to the end of the book, but it makes us grateful for turning the pages. We say, that was time well spent. An analytic and a phenomenologist who has read an analytic and at the end says it is good would probably say, and I am better for it, because I've had an experience heretofore I otherwise would not have had I not been given the analytic. And this is why phenomenology has long been put or needed in the same dough as hermeneutics, that is the interpretation of texts or the interpretation of history, or psychologically speaking, the interpretation of memory. Because it's all about character formation as we're going through a navigational pattern. And in the moment the navigational pattern gets ahead of the character formation, we have to stop, we have to halt, because then we're moving out of the intended purpose of the analytic into mere description, mere report, mere external reality that we might not have a connection to.
Okay, let's stop there, because I think you've hit on something super interesting here, and I want to put a pin in the interpretation of memory to see how that fits in there. But but this whole idea of the analytic, I'm not quite clear on what the analytic is, but what I hear you saying is that the analytic is bringing along the reader or the experiencer, bringing them along through this analytic so that they are, by the time they get to the finish line with the experience itself, they're prepared to have that experience in concert with the other, so that there it's a unity of sorts when by the time you get there. It's really interesting that you brought that up, because this morning I was reading the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, and I think it was in there that something popped out that really struck me, very similar to that. It's always hard to find something like that when you're trying to think your way through it, but maybe it's Hebrews chapter 2. Let me just take a look really quick here. So the book of Hebrews, as people might remember, chapter 11 is the chapter on faith, about all the different believers from the Old Testament who were exhibits of faith. And so there's this great cloud of witnesses who have gone through the valley, who have gone through the suffering, have gone through the struggle. And let's see how they put it in the book of Hebrews. It starts out with talking about faith being the certainty or the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. This one I thought was a really interesting verse. All these died. He goes through all these different people who had faith, Abraham and Moses and all these people. And then it says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. We always have this sense of not being there. We always have this sense of the promise is not yet. The promise has not yet been completed. And this last two verses in chapter 11 are, all of these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised. It's still out there. They didn't receive it yet. They lived through all these things. They suffered through all these things. They were gaining what it needed to be there, but they couldn't be there yet. They did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Now, that made perfect, that word in the Greek has to do more like having become fully fitted, to the function. So this whole experience that we go through, all the sufferings of life and all the things that we learn and everything, is getting us ready for this moment when we will be there, when the promise is fulfilled. But for some reason, that promise isn't fulfilled until everyone has been brought in. See, it says God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, all those witnesses apart from us haven't received yet. But when everyone is gathered in, that promise is going to be, and that's what that made me think about when you were talking about language as the analytic vehicle to take us to the experience, to be transformed so that you can understand, so that you can come into connection with this truth. So those guys are using language as a vehicle, I guess, so that we can abstractly have that experience, but our lives are the vehicle of all the different things we go through in our lives are that vehicle that are taking us to that place.
And if I may say, in response to that verse and that explanation, notice, and I had never thought of this before, but as you read it seems to be so. It, in its construction, it takes as a middle term between who is spoken about first, that catalog of all the saints,
Mm-hmm.
and on the other side, the us. It has as a middle term first, they greeted the promises from afar. So you can imagine this line between them and this thing and the distance thereof. And in the other half of the verse, it says, so that they, to paraphrase, would not be made perfect apart from us. So it takes that line of distance from where they were to where it is, recalling to mind Moses standing far from the promised land, but seeing it,
Mm-hmm.
to their distance from us and our distance from them, and that becoming smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not looking to the shoreline of water coming that has its measure, but we're looking to the other as person who is coming to us to receive us after long waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And that shift is not only a shift of time, but of attitude, because how I would regard a thing is not how I would regard a person. And so
Mm-hmm.
even that sense of attitudinal regard, or what the phenomenologists call intention with our whole body and spirit, as the Christian would say, and soul, that orientation and direction is moved from a thing to a person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Time is involved in that, but it obviously transcends time, because the time it takes to go from Sioux Falls to California, time participates in that journey, but the time between two friends, time participates in that journey, but we understand there's a qualitative difference. This comes
Yeah.
to the question of, can our universe contain all these differences? If there are these orders of magnitude that we use the same word time for, the time between Sioux Falls and California, and the time between two friends getting to know one another, or let's say, let's make it even more dramatic, an enemy to a friend, or an enemy to an enemy where they both become friends. However you want to look at the reversal. Time participates in all three of those situations. But we understand that if we want to do those three times justice, we have to talk about those three times with a different emphasis, right? A certain cadence, a certain analytic, a certain things we would want to convey to the listener for them to take in. Things I would focus on between two friends in their time getting to know one another, I would not focus on in saying, well, you got to look out for that pothole on the road because that won't be good for your tires. Sure, metaphorically, I could build bridges, but we know we're doing idle work when we do that, because you can make an allegory out of anything, C.S. Lewis would say. So there seems to be some real difference that calls for some real difference in the analytic, even though we're using the same word time. And my question is, can this universe hold the heft of all three of those times at once? It seems to. The philosopher would say it certainly at first blush seems to, because I live in a world where I'm in my car driving somewhere on the phone with another person, and I'm giving both of these activities my time, but I'm not giving them the same time with respect to my attitude or regard or my spirit. But I'm in the same big umbrella world or tent world where it's holding both of those spaces. Or it's not. If a person thinks the universe just isn't that big, it's far more finite than that. But if they think, well, Matt, you're undercutting your case, it's actually much bigger than all three of those times. And so it's practically infinite. Is the universe finite or infinite? That's something philosophers have asked. I, for one, do not know. Because again, it comes back to we have all these colors and lines and points that we bring to these words beforehand. It's a result of our memory and experience and training. Partly a few daubs of and scribbles of our wish, too. Things unfulfilled, that certainly biases us towards certain interpretations of infinity. Because maybe there's time for that. Well, to go back to Christos Yannaris, he said something which I found quite helpful as far as a tool goes. So is there a way to talk about the infinite and the finite without cluttering up with unnecessary detail? It's probably a lifelong goal, that one. But something he says that seems to be helpful is let us distinguish methodological a prioris from ontological premises. I'm paraphrasing a little. So an example of a methodological a priori would be something that we take as given, but have no good reason to believe it exists. But because the results of taking this thing as given are so helpful and seem to have an obvious connection to our navigation in this life, even if they're not real at their base, these a prioris, not for the life of me. Maybe if I have a 45 put to my forehead and I'm against a corner, I'll put it down. But otherwise, in the normal mode of life, where I know where my water is and I know where my food is, and my friends are not too far from me, I'm not going to give up this a priori, even if it doesn't exist.
Can you give me an example of a methodological a priori?
I'll take it from Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is often considered the the best at this, or the one who at least has given us a system that most people imitate, whether they know it or not. And he did not come up with this in a vacuum, so maybe it undercuts the whole reality of a priori, since he borrowed from a tradition. But be that as it may, the example is this, which he takes from Descartes. I think one of your conversation partners talked about Descartes and the dualism
Mhm.
stemming from Descartes. Pardon me, I have something in my throat. There we go. Descartes is famous in his meditations for doubting everything except the fact that he could not doubt his capacity to doubt, which he associated with the cogito, or his thinking ability.
Mhm.
Even if he even if he did not understand his character and where it was alongside the formation line of somebody else's analytic, he knew that at any point in space, there was a cogito thinking. And he never found himself outside that thinking. So that must be him. Immanuel Kant took that I think, therefore I am formula, the cogito, at any point in space, but he narrowed it down to this bottlenecked I think. And he said the I think is the a priori that any human being on the face of the earth, regardless of their language, regardless of their accidents, regardless of their aspirations, every single human being finds themselves in the subject and in the verb of that statement. And he says that's quite something because why should my I be the vehicle for the many out there? He says, I can't explain it and I don't even believe it because it's my I. It's not the guy in New York's I. Hey, I'm walking here. It's not his I, it's mine. I think, or I, whatever the verb is, I move, as St. Maximus would say. He would make it far more general. I move Well, why should that I be for anybody else? I don't seem to ever be outside that. And there doesn't seem to be room for another consciousness. People call that crazy when you have split personalities. Immanuel Kant saw that you could have all these possible divergences into a psychologism where, yeah, it sounds like split personalities. The many and the one problem is solved by one consciousness that's schizoid. And we're all the instantiations in our separate consciousnesses of that one schizoid surplus of unity. That sounds like I'm saying one thing and contradicting myself. It doesn't sound quite right because I don't hear voices. To avoid that reduction to a psychological mode of diagnostic speaking, he said, we can't we can't go behind the curtain and see who's pulling the strings to make the odds of I. We can't go back there. If we do, we'll get in trouble. Not by God or by the universe, but through our own limit. This is why he called it the critique of pure reason. Through our own limit, we will harm ourselves by asking the question behind the question. But what that humility has as an effect of not going behind the curtain and seeing what is there is by limiting our reason or by seeing that our reason peters out at that moment, it limits itself. It's hit the tarmac. It can't go up anymore. At that moment, you can't say that the thing that is most basic to whatever you're going to assert as true, that basic thing has any evidence speaking for it. Okay, so let's forget about that. Let's go real quick. Nothing to see here, folks. Step two. Once we've got the a priori of I think, then I can start to say, okay, if there is an I and that I is the vehicle for everybody else, I've solved the problem of the one and the many. All right? There are many, one word for the many. Now I can move on to sense perception. Okay, there seems to be a table here. I touch it, it seems to be compressive and gives back. Okay, this is in keeping with the I that thinks or touches or feels. Okay. But what's lurking in the background of all that Oz, all that sparkling diamond, almost perfect, and this is contemporary with Immanuel Kant, perfect absolute space of Isaac Newton, because Immanuel Kant is a child of Isaac Newton's science. He lived in the world of absolute space and time.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I think it was in one of his dissertations when he was graduating college, that he was going to figure out how to live in this world of absolute space and time. And in other words, he was going to bring philosophy up to date. And so when he talks about these a prioris, he's speaking as the billiard balls moving on the pool table. Don't ask me how the balls got there. I don't want to look underneath the table and see them rolling out of the corner from the darkness. All I care about is their configuration in space after the initial pop of the cue. That is to say, after the initial I think. And he took that from Descartes because after Descartes doubted everything except himself, he could then begin again. And this matches with your conversation partner, who's the C.S. Lewis scholar. This allowed him to pop out from the bottom of the hero's journey up. He could come to his bottleneck compressed I think from Descartes. I must exist because I'm in that thinking thing. I'm never outside of it, at least. To sense perception, from sense perception to human beings in society, from society to organisms, from that to what we would now call evolution and deep, deep time where free radicals are roaming about like animals. That seems to go on quite nicely until, and I think we're hitting that other side of the bottleneck with AI, we're starting to discover, and through your conversation with the professor who discovered the chiasm in xenobots, if I remember correctly, or the xenomorphs, how in any moment in time we find something like creativity. We find something like autopoiesis, which is to say, wherever we are, we seem to be doing this possible move of nothing to see here. Here's my a priori. Here's my method. I'm building it from the ground up as far as I can see. And I know I can't go behind the curtain because then I'll ruin everything. But from this method, I can do a lot of stuff. I can build this nice little home, this nice little nest. I can lay eggs. I can have a family. I can have self-dignity when I look in the mirror. I can call myself a somebody. I can have status in my local society. I can do a lot as long as I don't go beneath that first step. That is methodological a priori. It's what led to American pragmatism. It's what led to the bumper sticker, if it works, do it. As long as it works, you can't argue with what works. Versus an ontological premise. And this is Christos Ioanneros and if Immanuel Kant is the best one at explaining the methodological a priori, academic consensus around history of religions and philosophical history of religions are finding a lot of fertile ground in Maximian studies, or the studies of St. Maximus the Confessor. And Christos Ioanneros is one of the proponents of that sort of study. So if we look at the church fathers and what they wrote and how they said what they said, St. Maximus sticks out for academics for one reason or another. Part of the reason is he was great at being a philosopher, but not only a philosopher. He was able to tie in his gorgeous systems into the daily life of Christian. Now notice I said a Christian. That is to say, he was able to tie all this gorgeous hierarchy into the daily life of a particular mode, a particular phenomenology, a particular experience of life. And that movement of what seems to be all encapsulating down to what's between the ears of a faithful with a tradition behind them and a particular orientation towards the future, not just whatever happens, happens, man. We're in the domino ride of life. It's more of an eschatological, we're going to judgment. That kind of finesse into precision, he never missed a beat. He was able to talk about that and talk about the Neoplatonists and talk about the Neoplatonists. That excites so many scholars, and it should, because it seems to be what Thomas Aquinas did with Aristotle, except Maximus did it with the Neoplatonists without himself becoming a Neoplatonist. Because a Neoplatonist would not have the phenomenology, would not be seduced by or find compulsory as a matter of conscience to adopt the analytic. You see, the Neoplatonist has a different analytic. That's an ontological premise. And so I didn't define that yet. Christos Ioanneros would say it is okay to open the curtain. Go behind the eye. Because when you do that, you come to find, yes, it's scary. And yes, it is surprising. Just like the phenomenologists said it would. So they were trying to prepare us with their rhetoric and their way of talking and their way of being verbose to sort of numb us into a healthy, safe surprise at what is inevitable. A kind of collapse that, to use Christos Ioanneros' language, existence comes from a mode of being. It comes from an action. It's not there waiting to be spun like a top on the surface of an infinite landscape. It's moving makes it, which means, to put it very simply, what we do matters. And it does something to the past, namely changes it, by putting us into a future we would not have had we not done what we did in the present. And we all know that. And Christos Ioanneros would say, we all know that because we're speaking now from a premise, a base of ontology, not of method. I can't tell you how I got there, other than to say, well, you're hearing me, and your hearing me participates in human nature, because it's not the fact that you have ears with a certain trigonometry in the cochlea that allows for wave functions to bring out this word Karen. It's the fact that you and I share human nature that you're able to distinguish my voice from the voice of leaves on a limb. We participate in something that the tree does not. And so we have insider's knowledge as to what we're talking about. It's not because you and I both know the rules of the same game. That is, if you want to talk about an ontological premise. If you want to talk about methodological a priori, yes, we have to have an expert class. We have to have the games and the rules carefully delineated so people can learn how to get insider's knowledge and begin to participate. But you see how those two modes can lead people, even the same person in two different seasons of their life, to do two different experiences of life. And that finally touches on the finite and the infinite, because way before this type of distinction of ontological and methodological, way back to Aristotle and the Greeks, when they had their paradoxes of how Achilles could not run faster than a tortoise if the tortoise had a head start, you had these paradoxes of how you could never really move if you tried to define motion too carefully. In those statements, there's an implicit distinction between potential and actual infinite. So just like the infinite is larger on an intuitive scale than the finite, there's a certain poetry in saying not only is it larger, but it has more in it than the finite. So of course, the infinite is going to have two classes that the finite does not. The finite is there or it's not. That is, it's actual or potential, whereas the infinite is potential and actual, depending on how you view it, because it's so big.
Mm.
And math mainly is on the train ride of the potential. But the main thing I want to say with all that is the methodological and the ontological, and I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I want to go back to earlier before we started breaking down the methodological and the ontological. You were talking about the analytic, and I think you mentioned that was coming out of Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
I might be entirely wrong, but I think what I hear you saying is that whole move with the analytic is something that a philosopher or a literary person or linguist can use as a kind of a control mechanism to move you from A to B along the path that they want you to go along. And along that path, changing you in such a way that you are prepared to receive what they're going to give you, even if that's not something that would have naturally arisen for you, or even if that's something that's not good for you. like maybe it's something that a certain German dictator could convince people of, using an analytic like that to create a new way of thinking and get you into a different space so that whatever he wants to bring you, he can bring you and you're going to receive it and it's going to, okay. Versus this ontological premise, which starts from the basis that because we are both human, we share already a world, but each of us is entirely unique in the way that we share that world, so that when we do come together to talk about a premise, we're going to have different perspectives, but that's going to flesh out the beauty of the world that we share more than you trying to convince me of something by leading me along some path. Did I
Absolutely. And I'm glad you hit on the head of the nail of uniqueness. One of the things, to come back to this ontological premise, as you said, should be stressed is in the language of Christos Ioneros, and I think St. Maximus, when he talked, because St. Maximus is always speaking of the relation between the logi and the logos, the many and the one, as a relation of kinesis, of coming closer or going further apart. If you go to the beginning of the early church in the work, the Didache, which is a collection of the teachings of the apostles, the 12, one of the things they say, echoing Moses, speaking to the people of Israel in the desert, choose this day life or death. So we have an either or. We have two paths that presume motion through. and motion through one is not motion through the other. And so the end of one is not the end of the other. Now, notice the language there, life or death, is not the language of true or false. Maybe you want to incorporate true and false into that, but just like the time spent on my phone talking to a friend, even though it's the same minute hand ticks, we understand there's a qualitative difference, sort of an uplift, more density in that time than the time of the four tires moving to the grocery shop. Even if it's the same 10 minutes, it's not the same 10 minutes. Life and death is a either or, true and false is an either or, but they're not the same either or. So with regard to uniqueness then, this is the language of Christos Llaneros, the person finds their unique hypostatic or substantial standing before the other in action. And so that action, since it is found, is discovered, is revealed, is manifested in the other as relation to, it can reasonably be mapped onto response language. Not the parody of that, which is, well, I poke the slug with some electric shock and the slug does this or that. See, it's receiving a stimulus and responding. I would call that a parody. It does things. It teaches us, I suppose, things. But it's such a reduction. It's not even the piano versus the orchestra. It's a key of the piano versus the orchestra. The language of response, call and response, is a language of choreography, the writing of the movement. And that, while it doesn't offer a solution in the sense of here's the answer at the bottom of the writing, at the bottom of the page, it offers a solution in the sense of it fills out all the nooks and crannies, just like that book, Paralandra, that we read, or I forgot the name of that book.
Out of the Silent Planet?
No, remember, it's about that person who goes into that big mansion and it's full of water and flooding and all those paintings. Piscati?
Oh, Piranesi.
Yes. In the first few pages of Piranesi, the flood waters throughout the house, it's fulfilling the house.
Hmm.
That sense of solution as filling out all the nooks and crannies, taking
Hmm.
it into itself, but also filling itself out with
Hmm.
all the properties and possibilities of that space, that simultaneous out in presence is the solution offered by the choreography of call and response, which is typified in the Christian experience of relation to the other, whether it's to the brother, to the sister, to the many in congregation as the body, signaled throughout the service, the work of the people. They're not standing there receiving information, they're doing stuff. They're processing, walking, they're
Hmm.
chanting, singing. They are praying, which engages the mind, the intellect, the concentration. They're all doing that together, and it's somehow solved, not in the sense of, hey, man, take your turn. We're all getting out of this plane, not at the same time, but in a line. You wait until I do this thing, and then I do my thing, and then you do your thing, and then we're all on set together, and time is precious. We need to know our roles, and maybe you'll have a different role in 10 years, but you've got your segment. Instead of that sort of linearity of finitude, it's the in solution at the bottom of the page. See, it all calculates to this. It's a solution of, wow, this is a crammed room full of people giving each other some space, but also rubbing elbows, standing. And there's this music, this melody of things kind of toppling on top of each other, but not quite. And then there's someone offering the bread and the wine, and now it's becoming something I can't quite see, but I'm going to participate in. And have I cleansed my all this together. It's a solution in the sense of the flooding of the house is a solution, not a solution as, see, 4 on the right-hand side of the equation, 2 plus 2. And I, I think it's brazen to say that is the infinite and the finite touching, or as Peterson would say, the mythological and the objective touching. But it does make that duality a sort of missing of the point, a sin of the mind, to use the language of the fathers, a distraction that keeps our head out of our heart, that is out of prayer, that is out of the temple of God, out of being with God in communion. If we're made for that relation and we're distracting ourselves with, I wonder how many angels dance in the head of a pin. We're not only just distracting ourselves, we're malnourishing ourselves ontologically. And it doesn't mean I need to keep a stopwatch how long I'm being malnourished versus nourished, because that would be to fall prey to a methodology, an a priori. There wasn't a clock in 787 like I have on my Whirlpool microwave. So we want to be careful with such things, especially with respect to time and tradition. But that sense of solution as filling out, fulfilling.
Well, yeah, so it's so interesting. Everything I read this morning in the scriptures is just all the tumblers are falling into place. So, as you were talking about the motions of going through the liturgy and all that, it made me think about square dance as a sort of a secular version of this. And for those who have never participated in square dance, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown. Square dance, a lot of people's experience with square dance is they learned one dance when they were in elementary school and they did it and they think that's what square dance is. But modern square dance actually has an incredible number of intricate steps that you have to learn before you can actually fully participate in square dance. So you can go to classes for like 6 months every week and for 3 hours. And then you have another day during the week when you practice the steps that you've learned while you're watching other people do more intricate steps that you don't know yet. And at the end of the 6 months of training, you now have learned 137 different steps. By step, I don't mean a step. A step can be a whole set of routines that fit together. It might be 30 seconds worth of motion is in this step. And then the entire experience of square dance is listening to the caller who is simultaneously singing a song that you become familiar with all these songs, but he's singing the song and then he's calling the steps. And as he's calling the steps, the 8 participants, the 4 couples in the square, are executing the steps together. So by the time you get through this whole song, you've done this incredibly intricate dance that none of you could have done alone. And if a person had done it alone, it wouldn't even look like anything. But with all 8 people working together, it's this amazingly choreographed thing that's happening. All the time that it's happening, you're holding hands with people you don't know, and your body is in motion, and the music is entering you and filling you, and then the filling of the music in you is manifesting this pattern on the floor. So yes, the water is washing in you just like it does in Piranesi's house. And simultaneously, the water is washing in the whole crowd because there might be 20 circles on the floor, 20 squares on the floor of people doing this together. In fact, I went to some square dance events where there were maybe 200 patterns on the floor, all simultaneously going to this music. And so becoming a square dance caller is quite a calling, let's say. I mean, there was a time I even thought, gee, I think I'd like to be a caller, because you have to have so many of these patterns in your mind, and you have to be able to see ahead. When you're singing this song, you have to see in your head which pattern would fit in this spot, and then get the pattern into that spot so that the whole song works together. Well, that's what it means to have call and response. Because the other thing that makes me think about is I've talked often about this thing that I call experiential DNA. And people have said, well, what you're saying, you're just talking about John Vervaeke's relevance realization. And there are some similarities, but what I mean by experiential DNA is the way that I have been equipped from birth through all the experiences that I've ever had, and music that I've heard and books that I've read and conversations that I've participated in and walks that I've taken and looked at the trees. And every single experience in my life has made me a certain person with a certain set of experiential DNA that's different than yours, that's different than anybody else's. So that when you say something to me that makes sense to me, what that means is it's filling me. That idea is attaching to all of my experiences in my life and being translated through that set of experiences into a meaning in my mind. And there's probably no way I could ever relate that meaning to you. That's why they need that analytic, right? But there's no way in all the universes that I could ever relate that meaning to you because you'll never be me. You'll never have my experiences. I don't care what analytic you have, you'll never be able to have my experience. But that is the filling that takes place when you're truly in relation with another person, when you're in conversation with another person, and true meaning is taking place. It's filling in all those spots in me. And then when I start to talk, I'm trying to talk through that filter to you, and you'll get it through your experience, but you'll hear it in a new way. And that newness is always happening. That's what keeps the world new and continually creation going on all the time, because each of us has this unique set of experiences that inform everything we hear and receive.
If I could follow up with a question, does that tie in with what you've spoken about in the past in terms of non-entropic growth? With respect to some dimension, let's take the universe, how things are building up, they're not degrading into a lesser memorial.
Okay, so I think you're thinking of the word negentropy,
Thank you.
which is like negative entropy. And there are some uh, biologists and scientists that use that word when they're talking about life,
Okay.
because we think of everything as we we think that the world is always degrading, always losing order. Like a garden, if you don't take care of it, is going to end up being filled with weeds, and eventually the plants will die, and that'll be the end of it. But if you take care of it, if you put energy into it, then the garden will grow and can be orderly and can produce fruit. Well, life is different because life is always producing order. Um, we do have to put energy into it. We have to eat, we have to be in the sunshine, we have to drink water and all of that. But there's something about life that keeps itself going, that has this constant will to stay alive. And so the constant will to input energy in order to keep the thing going. This has to do with it really has to do with the whole creative process, because what makes, like, if you think about a painting, what you're really doing is taking infinity and reducing it down into something manageable so that you can express it.
Yes.
So I am this person, any of us are people filled with all this experience and creative potential and looking out into a field of infinite potential and trying to grab hold of that and say, I'm going to create something in the world that has substance. I'm going to make a painting, or I'm going to build a box, or I'm going to make um, I'm going to make a hummingbird feeder, whatever it is you're going to do. You're trying to figure out how to do this, but you're looking at a field of infinite potential and trying to understand what of that you can gather into this space to, so basically you're compressing space into a small unit. And there's something about that compression that generates creativity.
That's amazing. Uh, quick thing I want to put in juxtaposition to what you just said. Recall from the gospel, the saying from the Lord. I will paraphrase. Judge not that you be not judged. Okay, hold on to
Mm-hmm.
that verb, judge. You say to your brother, let me get the mite out of your eye.
Mm-hmm.
But let that be an echo of what you're describing in terms of an infinite instantiation of possibilities, some background desire. I want something like a bird feeder that I've seen before, but not quite because I don't want a reproduction because my hummingbirds are different and it has to not clash with the aesthetic of my backyard. It's coming together. There it is, the mite. It's in your eye. It's the movement of compression in the other person's organ of sight. Notice the poetry of it. It's so beautiful. It itself is an onomatopoeia of compression. So he says, it's not this stale moral code. When you say to your brother, let me get that speck out of your eye, I found it. He says, at that moment, stop. What are you doing? Don't you see reorientation of that energy which would instantiate? Don't you see that the log is in your own eye? But let us remember our ontological premises. The log wasn't there as a given, just boom, it was there waiting to be discovered. The speck wasn't there just boom, waiting to be discovered. And it's not because I need to harbor guilt, because I'm such a bad person, that we have to make like Pinocchio's nose. We need to make that log grow a little bit bigger because it's for my own good. I need to be curbed in that way. That's a strange reading. But if you look at it as an observation of action, in harmony with what you described about how we instantiate attention, this is very Peugeotian, I suppose, how we instantiate our attention, we can do that instantiation in one of two directions. We can do it and locate it on the other. See the speck, it's right there. I found it in you. I found the thing that's going to help you. Let me help you. This is good for us if I help you. That sounds good. And the motivation is thrilling. But objectively speaking, look where I've put that energy of instantiation. It's like that little point. It's my future. I'm going to help you. It's going to help us. Me helping you is going to help us. I have my reasons. That we do it all the time. But what the Lord's asking us at that moment, struggle. A little bit of struggle, which is life. And here's why. It's not guilt, it's life. Because in that struggle of stopping myself from instantiating on the other, if I took that energy and instantiate on myself, the tradition calls that humility. Because at that moment, the reason the log is so thick is it's the tree of Psalm 1. Forgive me, I'm just putting that there. It's the perennial tree that bears its leaves in its seasons, and its leaf does not, that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. It meditates on the law of the Lord day and night. I cannot meditate on the law of the Lord day and night on the other's time and bandwidth. It's impossible. But if I'm so distracted with the might of my instantiated bird feeder in the other person's pupil, then I'm distracted from praying in the temple. I'm not going to Jerusalem. I'm stopping to chastise the Samaritans. But if I bring it back and instantiate in myself, I find a big tree with fruit and also some pruning that I can do. In other words, I find a whole life. And that bringing it back into my body is not only the prodigal coming to himself, which allowed him to go to his father, but it's the very thing the brother who stayed outside the house when he heard the music didn't do. Because notice what he said to his father who came out to him. Look, that son of yours lost it all, and you killed the fattened calf for him. The only thing that wasn't said was, explain yourself. Don't you see what I see in you? What you've done, what he did. Specks, specks, and specks. Apparently, for that brother, two specks make a log. But that's why he didn't go in the house. Whereas the brother who went in, where the music was, he had instantiated that tree inside. He came to himself. That's all I'm simply trying to say is the
Mhm.
fathers associate that with humility. And it is that movement of the building of the bird feeder, as you said. Our
And
attention to
it's such
one
a
of
very
the ways.
modern, such a very modern thing, isn't it?
Yes.
To come to that understanding. As a parent, I think that's one of the very hardest things as a parent, as you see, because because your child is basically an instantiation of you, right? And then you see in your child, you see the specks in your child that have been your logs all along. So you're very conscious of where those logs are and how they show up as specks in somebody else. So you're always wanting to fix that in your child. And yet that's exactly what you can't do, because if you do that, you're taking their agency, you're taking their creative potential, and you're stopping your own agency and your own creative potential, because you've got yourself all wound up in their life instead of letting them live their life. Yeah, I mean, it's a very modern thing.
It allows us to bless the other. When we find, because a person could say this has an optic metaphor. As you implied, seeing a speck could be a big tree from a distance.
Uh-huh.
That optical distance could be perceived as a memory, because memories seem to always be a little far from us and fading as time goes along. That speck we see in the other reminds us, is a memory of our own log that we've lost sight of, which
Mm-hmm.
could be a blessing to us if it's the tree of Psalm 1. And so we can bless them, maybe silently. Thank you for reminding me of where I am.
Mm-hmm.
And it can serve that purpose. Whereas if we try to change it, we're not remembering and we're missing out on blessing them, even silently, thanking them for being, thanking them for being. Their being reminds us of our being and where our being is.
Hmm.
Strange philosophical way of talking about it, but
No,
it
but
involves movement.
I really like it, because it takes the focus off of um, walking around with your head hung down low with shame over your own stupidity, and instead being able to say, okay, this is a place where I can give thanksgiving. I mean, Thanksgiving seems to really be where it's at.
Absolutely. That's our service. That is our
Yeah.
spiritual worship. And it makes it real. These commands make it, or that sounds so harsh in English, but when the Lord said that in the gospel, that thing for us to observe, it's not a duty thing. It's a way of life. And that's why I wanted to bring it out is in concurrency with your use of the word life. Life doesn't decay. It's not just waiting for an input all day long. It's it itself builds. And this is why, to quote Moses, we choose life or death, which is to say something stronger than truth or falsity. Because I hate to say it, speaking of the 21st century and AI, we've already mapped the science of 0, 1, of truth and falsity. In other words, of navigation. Calculations can say this or that so quickly and find paths and I was on a plane the other day. It can make corrections faster than my reflex, faster than my evolutionary tutelage in being an organism. It's faster and it doesn't even have a pedigree behind it. So the 0 and the 1, the truth false distinction has already been outsourced into our technology. It's not something we can base our experience on anymore. That experience is always going to be looking us in the face. We're not going to be behind its eyes anymore. Analog is gone. But that's okay, because the highest form of the human being isn't truth or falsity. Moses called us and the Lord called us. The Didache, early document, called us to choose life or death this day. And as you said, if we choose life, we notice that it's where we belong because it grows us, it builds us, it does its thing. And it's not a series of decisions merely. It's a series of, well, things that can't quite be put into language, but can be experienced and verified. And it's best when that's verified in a group, that is in a tradition, in a congregation, in the square dancing. Like you said, if imagine one person does all that square dancing, it wouldn't look like anything.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be, to quote the person on Wall Street, it'd be a random walk in the park.
Yeah.
But not in his mind. In his mind, he's doing very complex things, and he is, but poor fellow, he can't share it with anyone. He's a tree fallen in the forest with no one to hear him.
Well, I kind of want to I want to get on a rag of convincing young people to go out there and try to find or try to get going some square dance clubs because the biggest problem young people have nowadays is finding a way to meet people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a perfect way to meet people because you're meeting people in an environment where you don't have to have anything to talk about. You can be social without having sparkling conversation on your lips all the time. But in between dances, there's a moment here and a moment there for some light conversation and get to know people a little bit, find out who they are. And the problem today is that most of today's square dance clubs are the remnants of the old square dance clubs. But 50 years ago, the square dance clubs were all young people.
Wow.
And some of them had 500 members. And that the square dance clubs where you go today and you meet people, most of the people are a lot older. Most of them are married. Many of them are married because they got married from the early square dance clubs. They met a partner there. They ended up falling in love and getting married. And then, but over time, square dance kind of fell out of fashion. And so now people look at it as an old people thing, but it's not really. It's a young people thing. It's very physical. And you can really do square dance to almost any kind of music that you want to, depending on how creative the caller is. So I really would love to see big square dance clubs form up in every state in the union, so that young people would have a place to meet each other. But anyway, we only have about 10 minutes left. And before we go, I wanted to ask you the question, are there any theological implications to whether we think of God as finite or infinite?
I believe so. And I think the reason for the implication is the use of the verb think. How we think matters, but it doesn't matter as much as we think. That is to say, when Jesus talks about entering the kingdom of heaven, he doesn't put it in terms that someone who is Gnostic and wants to leave their body would approve of. Because his examples of the kingdom and how to go into the kingdom and how to prepare for the kingdom have to do with the person in a body who's taking care of that body and is going to bring that body into paradise. The king says, the tables are prepared, come and eat. Oh, I bought all these animals. I can't. I gotta break them in. Someone else can sit in my chair. That's damnation. Someone else can sit in my chair is the damnation in that parable. And it's not them being judged by God. It's not infinity saying you'll never catch up. It's the finite saying to the infinite, give my seat, my chair to someone else. And that's finitude erasing itself. And in that parable, the finitude says, give my chair, give my number to another number, which is crazy. Give my chair to another number because I am more interested at this moment in time. I'm a little obsessed with these animals I just bought and my idea around these animals I just bought. They're going to allow me to see myself as a farmer. It means that I'm rich. My neighbors know I have all these animals. I could break that ground over there. They're building an infinite paradise at home out of these few numbered animals. When God is saying to them, infinity's right here. I've got your place prepared for you. So why don't you come in and sit? I've been doing all this work while you've been having your life. Do you want more? Yeah, but just not a good time for me. Don't you see I bought these animals? I wish you could have put it back another week. Or you could have done it earlier. Speck in the eye. Who does your planning? Not me, obviously. That lack of humility because of distraction, I would say, is the more traditional way of talking about the infinite and the finite than a more speculative route of reasoning by, well, the definition of infinity is X, the definition of finitude is Y, and these are the ways in which they contradict. Instead of talking that way, I don't want to talk that way as if talking that way makes a difference, because it doesn't.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, people can forget arguments. They don't forget relationships, because relationships go into your being and they affect your expression. And it sets the tone of the mistakes you could make in a way that mere deductive reasoning does not. So really, I mean, who cares if I forget how to play chess? Sure, it's going to hurt. It's going to be like, man, I used to be a 1700. Now I'm 852. I feel the loss, but at the end of the day, who cares? It doesn't even last beyond 10 minutes of caring. Rules like that and definitions and remembering the niceties of definitions, they don't really matter unless you're being paid to make them matter, I would say. But since God relates to us in the tradition as person, and he is person, he's personal, triune God, okay, incarnation, all that stuff. Some of the examples he gives relate to us not only in a way that tells us how we are going to experience our salvation, but they prepare us to experience that salvation. So they're an analytic to come full circle. One other example, and then I'm done. So we've heard all the tables are prepared, food is ready, people have their excuses. It shows that they're distracted. They're just distracted with their finitude. Finitude is far more dangerous than infinitude, because finitude is what can distract us with its peculiarity. Wow, that's so cool, man. That's the only addition. I'll give you $500. We get very hyperbolic about the finitude. And so it can be dangerous. That's if you want to talk in these categories of finite, infinite, you can use the Bible, you can use these things to talk about it. But the fathers would be more comfortable talking about it in a familiar language that we can actually act upon. So they talk about distraction. Those animals distracted the man from accepting what would be a better offer. Have a seat at this grand feast from the king. That's good for me. And you cared about me to prepare it for me. The animals are fine. They're going to eat the grass. They're going to be okay. And that's what he should have done, but he was distracted. So the lesson from that parable is not, here's the definition of finitude, here's the definition of infinity. It's don't be distracted. And then a person would say, okay, I don't want to be distracted. How? That would begin their journey to find a mentor, a spiritual leader, someone who can concentrate, or just to go to a square dance type activity where they can't help but be dragged along by a stranger, interlaced among strangers, and have the rhythm of the totality put through them involuntarily. That also makes one aware of, I can't be distracted right now, even if I wanted to be. And it trains us to choose life over death. The last analogy is when Jesus gives the last judgment. Pretty intense, right? But it's couched in such homely language that everybody can understand, whether they're rich or poor. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Come, receive the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. When did we see you thirsty? When were you hungry? I don't remember seeing you between the poles in the prison, your face. When you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. That language of taking care of, receiving a gift, giving a gift, having this circuitry of, I've got your back, you've got mine. We owe each other. We're building memories together. That give and take gets us into the kingdom. That's how we are remembered, by our remembering. Whereas those who say, well, why are we excluded? I never saw you there. When you did not do it for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. Finitude hurts. It's a cross. Not in a speculative manner, but in a manner of our actions matter, but not in a guilt trip way, but it's very natural. If left to my own devices, I would want to open the door for my friend. Come in. And if he's my friend, I'd say, man, let me give you a cup of water. That natural activity of revealing myself to the other in action and receiving their smile of thanks, knowing that when I'm thirsty, they'll help me too. They could betray me, but you know what? That is the indeterminacy of our not knowing everything, of our not bathing in the spas of the infinite. We have drops of water from the shower head every day that hit our temple. And we have to have faith and trust that the God who has brought us this far will bring us further. And why don't we be that for our neighbor? It's easy to do because we don't have to know what we're going to do before we do it. It's as simple as pouring water from the tap. It really can be that simple. And the fact that the Lord speaks in that way about such high stakes matters can scandalize someone if what they want is the philosophical dilemma resolved. But that's not what we're given. We're given an analytic that prepares us in life to receive the kingdom here and now and be prepared for the eschaton. We get to participate in heaven here, which is a scandal of the infinite, finally, as C.S. Lewis would say, intruding upon the frontiers of the here and now.
Mm.
As Father Sergius at St. Tikhon Seminary, where I went to visit my friend graduate this weekend, said, when God enters time, he doesn't enter it and then leaves, and then that time is in the past. He makes that time eternal because he was there. So he is there. So that time is now. So as time is incorporated into eternity, when we enter into those moments through the church, we enter eternity. And we might not be able to explain it, but it has its effects, and it has its effects here and now. And where it makes those effects manifest are in the fruits of the Spirit. We notice we're becoming a little more patient because we can endure time. That's not nothing. That is spiritual. That is heaven, being able to endure time. That is God. That is Christ incarnated with us as companion. And that endurance makes us want life more and more. And it doesn't make the choices easier, but it gives us trust. So it doesn't look like a mere true false. It looks like a choice of life and death, a choice of to be with my companion or to turn my back to my companion. And thank God he forgives us when we stumble. The prodigal son was not only brought into the house, his father ran to him from the house to embrace him.
I really like that picture of infinity being this place of abundance where all can come in, right? There's space for everybody who wants to come in. But then if you're distracted, like the maidens who forgot to have their oil prepared for the lamp, they got distracted, so they weren't ready.
But we do
that
what we
whole
can.
Picture of distraction is a good one.
We do what we can. It shouldn't feel heavy and it shouldn't feel too light. It should just be right. What's perfect for us. I'm saying too much, forgive me. We do what we can. Let's just do what we can.
Mm-hmm.
With God's help.
And with great thankfulness that the banquet is prepared.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. This has been wonderful, Matthew. We haven't solved any problems, but let me just share with you this one verse that I read this morning, because I think it fits in with everything that we were talking about. And again, this is from Hebrews, and I believe it was in Hebrews 11 again. Let me take a look here. Yes, Hebrews 11:3, and I'm going to read it in the interlinear version in the Greek. I'm not going to read the Greek, but I'm just going to read the translation there. By faith, we understand the universe to have been formed by the word of God, so that the things have been made from those things that are not visible. But this word to have been formed is actually that same word to have been made to be fully fitted, to fully fitted functioning. Like the world is made to fit everything perfectly. Everything is made to fit perfectly in the world. And then the word that was translated universe here is actually aeon. And that aeon has the meaning of continuing duration. The universe is a continuing duration. It's not, I don't know why they translated universe, because to me, it's so much more interesting to think of the continuing duration having been made fully fitted by the word of God. And that's what we understand by faith. So
That's amazing, Karen.
yeah,
Indeed.
yeah. I mean, I really, when you think about the world of science and what scientists are looking for, really, they just need to go back and look at the Greek or the Hebrew, and you see so many things that are like, wow, whoever wrote that Bible, they knew something. Yeah, beautiful words. Well, it's been great talking to you, and
You too, Karen.
very excited for your life there in South Dakota. You said it's cold there today. It's cold in California too. Um, I don't know what all that means, but let's stay warm and get prepared for the feast.
Indeed. Looking for the pockets of blue. Mhm.
Yeah. Have a great day.
Bye, Karen.
Okay. Bye bye.